I wish that you would be patient with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you are already being patient with me. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, because I promised you in marriage to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I'm afraid that just as the serpent deceived Eve by his treachery, your minds may be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus, different from the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit than the one you received, or a different gospel than the one you accepted, you put up with it well enough. For I consider myself not at all inferior to these super apostles. And even if I am unskilled in speaking, yet I am certainly not so in knowledge. Indeed, we have made this plain to you in everything and every way. Thus Paul spoke to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 11, 1 through 6. And this begins this section of his conversation that's called, aptly, the Fool's Discourse. It goes from here all the way through chapter 12 and verse 13. And this section, including chapter 10, verses 12 through 18, just before it, are all of how Paul is directly addressing what we believe to be this group of Jewish Christians from Jerusalem who have come to Corinth and are working to ingratiate themselves in and among the Corinthian Christians. And the way they're trying to do so is to undermine Paul's standing and integrity among them. We've already kind of gotten the hint that they have come and try to commend each other to, that they are always kind of lifting each other up and making them seem great. They have these letters of commendation maybe from Jerusalem. They're trying to suggest that maybe Paul went beyond his domain and turf by coming to Corinth and that really belongs to someone like them. Things of that sort. And so Paul's now going to start addressing some of the very specific issues going on that he feels are kind of beneath his dignity, beneath the dignity of the gospel. And he's doing with this framework of a little foolishness. And he's going to talk a lot about foolishness from here on through. And it's an important thing to keep in mind. It does present two situations we need to think about. First of all, it does suggest that as a Christian, there may be times where we can indulge in a little folly, in that kind of foolishness that's a rhetorical device. Because that's what Paul's doing with it. It's a rhetorical device. It's an opportunity for him to speak in frank ways or in ways that otherwise he may not, and be able to say, well, I'm just being a little foolish here. I told you I was being foolish, kind of as a guard against some of that stuff. He's going to use some sarcasm, some irony. He's going to really layer it on, as we're going to see. And so there might be times for that. However, we probably would not be wise to constantly be in that mode. And so everything we see here in chapters 11 and beginning of 12, we need to realize he's intentionally doing this whole foolishness frame. And so we need to be careful about that and how we would apply that and how we would do things in a similar way ourselves. And he explains that he is doing this because he's got this godly jealousy for them, because he presents himself according to this metaphor of a father of betrothed virgin trying to maintain the purity and chastity of his daughter for marriage. That is something that we might be a little uncomfortable with today, but it is definitely a socio-cultural norm, definitely patriarchal cultures of the time, where there would be a betrothal period, and it would fall upon the father to be the one to entrust that his daughter maintained her purity in order to get married. And if there had been any kind of indecency or impurity found in her, it would probably lead to, at best, a reduced bride price. At worst, it may mean the calling off of the marriage. And so this is how he's describing his godly jealousy, that he is in this framework. The fact that the church is supposed to be a pure bride, we see in Ephesians 5:27. There, the purity is established by the washing that Jesus does. And that's probably a more important way of keeping to look at that. And we should not try to act like the church has its own purity. Somehow, a minister is the one who is safeguarding the purity of the congregation. That would be taking Paul a bit too far. In 1 Corinthians 4:15, he already introduced the idea that he is like a father to the church in Corinth. It's not that Matthew 23:9 doesn't exist. You do not call anyone father, for you have one Father in heaven. But there's always been that tension there, the realization of what Jesus is trying to teach, and that even that's kind of hyperbolic because we still have earthly fathers, and they're mentioned as earthly fathers many times in Scripture, but that we shouldn't put too much investment in spiritual fathers to the point where we miss out on our Heavenly Father. So we should be careful how much we take with Paul's metaphor. We should understand it as well, that he's got this godly jealousy he talks about. And he wants the Christians in Corinth to be saved. And by establishing that, he's also starting to introduce, well, if I want you to be saved, what do these other people really want from you? And that's what he wants them to do, start really thinking about that. Now, jealousy is a very interesting and challenging concept. In Greek, the word is zelos. It's the same word for zeal. It can be zeal or jealousy. And normally we write jealousy off as a bad thing, for understandable reasons. It's the work of the flesh in Galatians 5:19-21. The same Paul condemns it as such. And certainly he does. That's why he calls it a godly jealousy. That the kind of jealousy that God himself has, right? That God was a jealous husband in the passages in Scripture for Israel. And that's the kind of idea that he's trying to communicate. And there is a place for that kind of godly jealousy, because it is a reminder to us in our much more individualistic age that, we are to have some care and regard for our fellow people. That if we see our fellow Christian going through things, or things, we should, it's just between him and God and whatever. No, we need to have some actual care and concern for one another, kind of like what Paul had for these Corinthian Christians. On the other hand, we need to be careful about that, because it's very easy to justify in the name of godly jealousy all kinds of worldly things. That we may have the best of intentions, but sometimes that jealousy is not purely godly, is it? That sometimes it can be a little selfish, a little greedy. And whenever that selfishness or greediness comes in, there's that worldliness coming in, that means it's now a less than godly jealousy. It's a worldly jealousy. And so, as in all things, we need to be careful with these kind of things. We need to encourage that spirit of godly jealousy while watching out to make sure that our jealousy is truly godly and has not devolved into something more worldly and something more like Paul's opponents than what Paul himself is doing. And he explains his reasoning. And the reasoning is he does not want them to be deceived like Eve was by the serpent, and to be led astray from pure and simple devotion to Christ. Pure and sincere devotion, excuse me. He brings up Eve here from Genesis 3. Essentially, he brings up Eve, not Adam, like he does in Romans 5. But again, the metaphor is feminine, so that's probably why it makes sense. But of course, there's also that thing introduced, right? That, Eve was on the right path and then was tempted away from it by the serpent. The Corinthian Christians, he's saying, were in the right path and devoted to Christ purely and sincerely. So what does that mean about the opponents? It means the opponents are in that position of the serpent. He's trying, again, to reframe the situation. Because, of course, they're probably there trying to say that Paul had led them astray from the beginning or something. And Paul's trying to get them to remember such things and to re-look at the situation the way that they should. And then he kind of really gets into his concern. And this one is definitely where there's some sarcasm. It's almost impossible to read Paul straight as saying, you have received these people teaching a different gospel and having a different spirit. You put up with them well enough, or you endure them very well. That statement is not sincere. That is a biting, ironic, or sarcastic comment. Oh, you put up with them well enough. And we get that because he says a different gospel. Now, in Galatians 1, of course, those who bring a different gospel are anathema. They're accursed. They're condemned. It's probably related that, of course, is referring to those who would compel the Galatians to Judaize and be circumcised and observe the law of Moses. What's interesting is that in Galatians, that's as close as they get to condemnation. The only thing he wants the worst for them in terms of their person is to emasculate themselves. But here, as we're going to see, he's really going to double down that full-throated condemnation of what they're doing and who they are, even if it's at a earlier stage in the series of deception. And they've already been chastised once for tolerating things they shouldn't. In 1 Corinthians 5, with the man who has father's wife, they should have not proven tolerant, but should have disciplined him appropriately. And so that's an open wound, probably, but Paul has to remind them again that they proved tolerant or they shouldn't, and it comes at their harm. Now, Paul did not consider himself as inferior to these ton huperion apostolon in Greek. That's coming right in the same context, so that's the people he's talking about. It can be understood as the chiefest apostles, which is why some in antiquity especially thought he was comparing himself to the 12, but that's really hard to sustain in light of what he's about to say about these opponents who are acting like they're equal to or superior than Paul, and then that he calls false apostles. Hard to believe Paul's going to call the 12 that. Instead, that's why most have taken it in this very also kind of sarcastic biting super apostles. That these guys have put themselves out there with all these commendations, and Paul is just kind of satirically commenting, there must be super apostles with all of this commendation. They've been sent from Jerusalem with all of these commendations. They must be that great and super. And Paul is just saying, I am not less than these guys. And he will, of course, continue to have much more critique for them and justify that statement from chapter 11, verse 16 through chapter 12, verse 13, that Lord willing we'll get to it another time. But there is one criticism they give that does seem to land, that Paul confesses that he is an idiotes in Greek when it comes to speaking. Yeah, you hear idiot in there. That's where we get the word idiot. Idiotes means unskilled or untrained in Greek. But he's not going to say anything about, he's not giving an inch about knowledge. The Corinthians Christians can even testify to how he is not inferior to them in knowledge, that he has received the gospel as revelation from Jesus. He's not going to be challenged or questioned in terms of his understanding of the gospel, especially his lived understanding of the gospel. Now, we love Paul. We might want to say, hey, Paul's actually not that bad a rhetorician. We've already seen some master rhetoric throughout 2 Corinthians, right? On the other hand, it wouldn't be too surprising, because Paul was trained well by Gamaliel as a Jewish Pharisee. He might have heard of some Greek philosophy and picked up some decent Greek while in Tarsus. But yeah, his writing and his speech does not convey the most highest echelon of professional rhetoricians that you would expect to find in the Greco-Roman world. In fact, the Hebrews letter is a very more advanced, elevated form of Greek even than what Paul has. So Paul is probably being sincere and honest here, in a recognition that, yeah, he is not. There are greater speakers than he. It's kind of ironic, a little contradictory for Jewish Christians from Jerusalem to come down and say Paul's not a good enough speaker. But it is possible that some of them might have been Hellenized and have gotten that training in rhetoric and were actually better speakers than Paul. Again, it's hard to know. We weren't there, so it's hard to speak about that. Paul will continue in verse 7. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you could be exalted, because I proclaimed the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so I could serve you. When I was with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia fully supplied my needs. I kept myself from being a burden to you in any way, and will continue to do so. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. And what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may eliminate any opportunity for those who want a chance to be regarded as our equals in the things they boast about. So, in verses 7 through 12, Paul turns to refute to what to us may seem a more odd lines of critique. That the truth everybody agrees is that when Paul was there in Corinth, he did not receive any financial support from the Corinthian Christians as he was working and ministering among them. And now that was being used against them, because the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem ostensibly were receiving that money. And they were using that opportunity to cast aspersions on Paul. Now, we might find that odd, but it would not have been in the ancient world, because not receiving that support might well have been seen as a lack of confidence or trust. And that by accepting their money, the Jewish Christians from Jerusalem are ironically trying to suggest that they have that trust in the Corinthian Christians and are willing to work with the Corinthian Christians the way that Paul was not. And if you notice, Paul is addressing this issue with biting sarcasm. Did I commit a sin by doing this? I robbed other churches. I mean, this is hyperbole, right? There was no robbery. The Macedonian Christians were not held up at knife point. They freely gave to Paul, probably from Philippi, based on Philippians chapter 4. But he's pointing this out with this very sharp language. Again, it's speaking according to foolishness and folly in order to just show how ridiculous the situation is. But it's not a matter that he acted like he didn't have the right to get money. In 1 Corinthians 9, he had already made that defense that he could get money. He seems to have made the decision not to receive support while in Corinth. And that probably says something with the Corinthian Christians, and probably not something good, that he did not want to receive their money so that they could lord it over him in some way or another. Perhaps. He wanted to remain financially independent from the Corinthian Christians for some reason or another. And he wasn't going to be made ashamed about that. He was going to continue that boast throughout Achaia, that he preached the gospel without charge. But he wanted to make it very clear that it was not out of a lack of love or concern. And that's why he invoked the witness of God, that no, he in fact does love them. You can't say that Paul didn't love them because he didn't receive their resources or their gifts. Now, for us, it's interesting to see here that he did not want to be a burden to them, and that it probably spoke poorly regarding the Corinthian Christians, right? That whatever the situation was, Paul decided, yeah, I don't want to take their money. And that can get to the very sometimes difficult matters when it comes to Christians financially supporting someone working in their midst. Because it is very possible for people who provide that support to start to look at as the person they're giving that support to as someone who is their hired hand, therefore somebody under their authority. It creates a very unhealthy dynamic where there are a lot of times where a preacher or someone working in the Lord's kingdom may feel that they are actually far better off not receiving financial support from those in their midst because of these kind of concerns. And again, that does not speak well toward the ones who would create that situation. And it's always a dicey situation, right? And there needs to be a level of respect and a level of accountability between those who are receiving funds to work in the Lord's kingdom and those for whom and working with the Christians there. But this situation is something to keep in mind when it comes to that we want to be much more like the Philippians, who were willing to give without those strings, without just to support Paul, than perhaps the Corinthians, where there might be strings attached and there might be some expectations, presumptions of a superiority or something of that sort. Paul continues in verse 13, "For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore it is not surprising that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will correspond to their actions." So at the end of the previous section, he said that he would not countenance that these people who are trying to act like they are equal or better than he is. And he's described now who these people are, that they are pseudo-apostoloi. They're false apostles. They're deceitful workers. They masquerade or disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. And he didn't find this surprising because, as he says, Satan disguised himself as an angel of light. Now, where does he come up with that? Maybe from some kind of apocryphal or pseudepigraphal works regarding Satan. Maybe just kind of as a conclusion based on understanding Satan as some kind of spiritual being and therefore some kind of turning that he would have done. And he also didn't leave anyone confused about what he thought about the opponents he has and they're associated with Satan. That servants of Satan would disguise themselves as servants of righteousness and they'll correspond to their action. Well, who was Paul talking about, do you think? Well, he's talking about these opponents, that they would go to hellfire and perdition because of what they're doing. Now, it's interesting that, again, that this kind of condemnation should not be surprised in light of Galatians 1:6-9, where those who preach a different gospel are anathema, or condemned. And our challenge is that we're only reading one part of the correspondence. It's very easy to say, Paul's being too harsh here. That's being a little too judgmental, a little too presumptuous. It wouldn't be too surprising if the Judaizing Christians from Jerusalem would have this kind of pattern, where they would go to a place that Paul had been. They would ingratiate themselves. They would get them to start questioning and challenging some of the things Paul said, relying on their ability to try to commend themselves as somehow more authentic, more ancient, going back further with the 12, cast aspersions on Paul and his ministry. And once that was done, to then start opening up, Paul was teaching you something that was wrong. Jesus was Jewish. You need to be circumcised. You need to observe the law of Moses. And the Galatians had accepted that to a very advanced level, which is what led to the letter to the Galatians, where it's much more about that issue and less about who was doing it. But here in Corinth, they're still in the ingratiating phase. They haven't actually gotten to the ultimate purpose of it. So that's why Paul is really going after the people involved and to reestablish his standing, especially since he is going to be with them very soon. And it doesn't seem like he had plans to go visit the Galatians anytime soon. And so that might be what's going on again. A lot of that is speculative. I want to be very clear about that. The text doesn't come out and say that. But in that kind of situation, we can understand why Paul would have this very harsh condemnation. They profess to be Christians from Jerusalem, but to what end are they working? Maybe they are great Christians in Jerusalem. Maybe they do a great job of encouraging their fellow Jewish people. But when it comes to what they're doing in Corinth, they're leading people astray. Now, when we look at this stuff, in this passage, we often hang up on Satan as that angel of light. And we understand why, right? Because we can see that it's a dazzling thing. And there are ways where Satan kind of presents himself as if he is really providing righteousness or what he's doing is righteous when it really isn't. But interestingly, note here that Paul is not trying to suggest that is somehow strange, that the Corinthians know that or that they should take it as obvious. Instead, his focus is on the servants, right? That if Satan can be like an angel of light, so his servants will come and masquerade as servants of righteousness. And that's the real takeaway that we need to have, is that we need to be careful lest we see somebody who professes to be a servant of righteousness, but their end really is to serve Satan. And they will share in that end. And there's no end to people, from the prosperity gospel, those who are advocating Christian nationalism, those who want to use the faith as a means for political gain or advantage, who are preaching that false gospel, who are servants of Satan. They're masquerading as if they're servants of righteousness, but the fruit, what they're ultimately looking for, is not the righteousness of God in Christ in the Spirit. Instead, it is something that's going to benefit the powers and principalities, the ways of Satan. And that is why it's so important for us to not be led astray by these people, to see them for who they are, to not countenance them, to to take a stand against them so that we are not deceived and we are not turned away from our pure and sincere devotion to Christ, in which we can find salvation. We're so glad you've joined us. Any questions or comments about 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 through 15, please let us know in the comments. If we may be of any service to you, please reach out to us at Christ.